I'd also like to thank Richard Martinez and his team from the Chamber of Industries for the invitation. This is my second trip to Ecuador. The last few days I've actually been in Loja, and I came in last evening for this opportunity. So very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. The intent of my presentation is to really share some experiences with you about the region that I live in and the company that I operate in that region. And really to share with you why we are very proud at both a national and a regional level of the work that we're doing in developing and sustaining a vibrant mining cluster. Now, rest assured, for those that are only partially interested in mining, a lot of the insight that I'm going to share today is applicable to other industries. And I will be here for the entire day, as well as the first part of tomorrow, if there's anything anyone wanted to discuss with me. I don't think it's any surprise that mining is very important to the country of Canada. As a big country, we're blessed with a lot of natural resources and a lot of capacity to produce a variety of minerals. From an employment perspective, there's nearly 400,000 people employed in the mining and/or mining supply and service industry, which I'll speak to momentarily. But there's also nearly 3,500 specific mining supply and service companies that serve the mining industry. Now, these are companies that may be technology enabled or not, but these are companies that serve the mining industry and enable it to grow and flourish. And from an importance perspective, obviously it's very material to our GDP, but it's also critical to our export market. And as you can see at the bottom, we pride ourselves on being global leaders in a variety of minerals that we produce. But what I want to do is focus more on a specific region in Canada. The province of Ontario, you can see where it is situated on the map. This is deemed one of the global leaders of mining innovation from the supply service sector. Now, from a materiality perspective, there's two main cities in northern Ontario that are really the epicenters of mining and mining technology and innovation. The region of Sudbury is the city where I live, and it's also where the company I run has its main office, but we also have another office in the city of Timmins. In Sudbury, we have about 12 active mines, primarily nickel and copper. About 3 hours north of that in Timmins, there's about 10 to 12 operating mines as well. Those will be primarily focused on gold, both open pit and underground. But collectively, in a very small region, we have around 25 to 30 vibrant active mines. Some that have been operating for 70, 80 years, now about 2.5 kilometers operating underground. Some that are relatively new. So from a cluster perspective, there's a lot of operating mines. What also is quite interesting from the future growth, there are about 35 active projects, feasibility studies underway to qualify, will we add more mines? Obviously, the economics right now of commodity prices are not the strongest, so there's a bit of obviously decision-making on behalf of the mining companies as to what will go forth. The other geographic landmark I want to highlight is Toronto. This region of northern Ontario, where most of the mines are, is only about 4 hours north of Canada's largest city, Toronto. That gives you just some geographic perspective as to where we lie. But the upper part of the province of Ontario only has about 900,000 people, and that region from a scale perspective is about the size of France. So it's a very low populated area where a lot of mines operate. Where Toronto is in south, in that little hook part, there's about 12 to 15 million people. The vast majority of the people in our country live in that region. But the key thing I want to focus on is on the mining supply side in the province of Ontario. And there's about 1,000 companies, of which about 70% operate in northern Ontario. Why? Because the vast majority of mines are there. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a landscape as to what we're going to be talking about in detail. Now, I've had the privilege of spending about 10 years of my career working with different jurisdictions around the world at a national level, provincial, state level, municipal level, working to understand what are the key enablers that regional economies need to support a vibrant innovation technology cluster to support an industry. And these are directly applicable to the mining cluster, but they're also applicable to other industries. And I want to share with you 10 years of research in my various company roles, some of the key things that enable this region to be competitive on the global stage. So I want to walk through a few of them. So what is the recipe book that we need to ensure that the Canadian mining industry in the province of Ontario is competitive? Well, first, obviously, we have mines. So there's a buy market there. But the second one I want to spend a bit of time on. The last 20 or 30 years, there's been a trend in the Canadian mining landscape, as well as others, where historically a lot of these mining companies had in-house research and development, in-house innovation departments, where they paid these individuals, locked them into a room, had science discussions as to how they can be more competitive. But in the last 20 to 30 years, there's been a trend towards outsourced innovation. And what's important about that, the total dollar amount that was historically spent by these mining companies isn't necessarily decreasing, it's that they recognize they no longer can essentially do it better. So let's take that pool of capital and create a supply chain of startup and small to medium enterprises to try to solve their challenges. So this notion of, if you look at the global trend in large mining companies, with the exception of a handful, a lot of them have been appearing to be divesting a lot of their internal research and competitive productivity levers. But what's really interesting is a lot of that money is being pursued through equity investors, capital markets, debt, through startup companies that want the opportunity to be creative to solve those issues that still exist in the mining company. So it's a very interesting trend, and that is a core ingredient as to why the cluster, I'm going to speak to a bit more, we believe is very successful. The other element we believe to be important is strong academic and research institutions. In Northern Ontario, we have a handful of universities generating engineers, technologists, but also we have a handful of colleges that generate skilled trades. So you have this supply chain of talent to fulfill roles not only in the mining companies, but also in the mining supply service companies. We obviously have strong, stable government, but the other thing is we have a pretty significant contribution of government in terms of supporting the startup and small, medium enterprise supply service companies that enable the mining companies to be competitive on the global stage. This comes in the form of either direct grants, capital that they can loan to companies, or just grant them in terms of a philanthropic contribution in some respects, or indirect tax benefits. But the government is a core ingredient to ensure that this mining cluster will remain vibrant. There is a role, especially in the research role, that many of these small startup companies need to pursue to solve the challenges of the big mining companies, because as I mentioned, a lot of the big mining companies have now divested those internal resources to the external startup, small, medium enterprise community. I spoke briefly to the workforce already. Livable communities. Now, most of you would associate, and it would be true, that part of Northern Ontario, for about 3 months a year, is about minus 30 degrees Celsius. It's dark and it's miserable. And there are, I don't want to call it isolation pay because we're not that far north in our country, but it does take a strong breed to want to be able to work, spend 12 hours a day underground or in an open pit for 3 or 4 months of the year when it's very dark and very cold and 10 feet of snow. But on the flip side, the summers are wonderful. So if anyone's ever interested, it's a great place to vacation. But the communities are healthy. There's clean water, clean air, clean resources. The other core enabler as to why I believe the mining cluster is being successful, and in part it ties back to the comment around the divestiture of in-house research by the big mining companies. There is a strong culture of collaboration among the mining companies to give opportunities to these small, very often sometimes untested pre-commercial companies a chance just to have a meeting with them to hear them out. Anyone who's been an entrepreneur or an active investor understands that one of the most difficult things you can do as a startup or small enterprise is get your first and then subsequently your second customer. So culturally, if the mining companies are divesting their internal R&D innovation assets, resources, but they don't give a chance to then allow these startup companies to have a meeting with them, it could be problematic. But that access between the buyers of technology and innovation and want to enhance productivity to actually listen to the supply side is a critical component that makes the cluster very strong. And then the last piece I've seen over the last 10 years, again, working with a variety of industries but holds true, is a strong understanding that the mining supply service companies, to be competitive and to make the mining cluster competitive in Canada, have to work outside of the country. They do that obviously for diversification of revenue, but they also do it to understand leading practices in other jurisdictions. We know as a mining industry and a mining supply service technology industry that we're not the smartest people in the world, but we have to constantly go out and understand what other jurisdictions are doing to bring back that insight, to do what we can to make our industry competitive. So I want to give a snapshot of the landscape, and most of this will not be surprising to you, but the next slide might be. So 93% of the mining supply, again, you can think non-technology companies that work with the mining companies, catering, janitorial, security, all the way through to very sophisticated technology companies that have products that the mining companies want. But at a macro level, 93% of these companies have less than 50 employees, but more importantly, 75% of them have less than 10. Our innovation cluster, as it relates specific to mining, 75% of them probably have around 8 or 9 employees. And at that, most of them are even smaller. So why do I care about that statistic? Well, here's something that is really interesting, and it was part of a global survey that is cross-sectoral and cross-geographies. Think of this, and this would hold true for Ecuador, I believe. Of all new companies started today, only 4 to 10% of them will become high-growth firms. And high growth is a subjective term to say these companies will create a material amount of jobs and wealth for the regional community. So the vast majority will not grow significantly and/or they'll go bankrupt. So startup companies are critical. Startup and small enterprises are critical to job growth. But within that 4 to 10%, only the top 5% of that small cohort will generate nearly 2/3 of the new sustainable jobs for that region. So the reality is, if you don't appreciate that and build in the infrastructure from the criteria that I talked about before to support and drive that, the innovation cluster, irrespective of industry, will not be successful. This drives sustainable job and wealth creation for economies and industries around the world. So what does that mean then? Well, I want to explain to you the role of NORCAT and what we do with one of our divisions. And NORCAT is a large company with multiple divisions. But one of our divisions is the NORCAT Innovation Mill. That is the graphical representation on the left. And the NORCAT Innovation Mill is our regional innovation center. Legally, it is structured as a nonprofit. And our job is to work with the community in Northern Ontario to either help start or accelerate the growth of scalable businesses to drive sustained job and wealth creation to ensure the cluster will continue to be vibrant and more particularly, make the industries, including mining, in that region more competitive on the global stage. So I'm going to speak a little bit more about that, but as a quick digression, the other half of NORCAT, on the right-hand side, is we are in the business of skilled labor training around the world. We work with mining companies, construction companies, to help do training, building programs and services, almost college-like in some respects. But we also work with regional governments to develop health and safety policies for a variety of skilled labor industries. So both a corporate and governmental customer. So at the NORCAT Innovation Mill, what do we do to ensure ongoing productivity and competitiveness of our innovation cluster as it relates to mining? And there's only 3 things that I want to focus on that I think are really interesting and important. And I spent, as I mentioned earlier at the onset, I spent the last 3 days in Loja working with CIMA and Prendo. And I don't know how many people are familiar with these 2 organizations, but they're working with us, and we're learning, and likewise they are learning, about the opportunity for setting up a regional innovation center ecosystem in addition to a mine training system. And we're sharing our experiences, what has worked and what hasn't. And we spent the last couple of days talking about what a nonprofit innovation center, what their role can be to drive a sustainable cluster as it relates to mining. So there's 8 things that we do to support that, but I'm only going to highlight 3. The first one that I'm hoping you find very interesting because I find it fascinating. As I mentioned, we are a nonprofit innovation center working with these startup, small, medium enterprises to really make the mining industry more competitive. These companies often need mentorship and advisory. They need to ask questions. So what we have done in our community to really ensure that you have a kind of a circular supply chain of engagement of community partners, all designed to say, let's make Northern Ontario, let's make mining competitive on the global stage for our country, is we created a mentorship program. And there's a lot of data to suggest that companies that receive mentorship grow between 5 and 6 times faster than those that don't. And that's it's pretty lengthy, credible research. But what we do is the more successful mining companies and the more successful mining supply service companies, as they get big, as they make a lot of money, as they start to retire, my job is to motivate and engage them to give something back to their community and mentor the next generation of startup companies. Why? Because they have to be convinced, maybe to a limited extent, or they have to recognize that their insight and contribution to inspire and motivate the next generation companies is critical for the sustainability of the ongoing cluster to be productive and efficient. The other thing that we have to do is we spend a lot of time trying to get sources of capital for these small startup companies, small, medium enterprise. We work very closely with government, we work very closely with the academic institutions, and a bit of a brokerage between these companies looking to solve challenges in the mining industry, small number of employees, trying to get going. How do they get access to capital? In Canada, it's very difficult for a startup company to get any debt financing because they have no history. Equity investors always want it to be de-risked. So what is the role that we can play to try to help them through that? So we administer some funds, we administer some grant capital, we partner with an array of venture capital funds to make them care about the supply service companies that we have. And the last thing I want to comment on is one of the other things that really is important for a vibrant mining innovation cluster is you need the opportunity as a small company to validate and test your technology in addition to in order to grow and to scale. And the key thing here is Norcat, we actually own and operate a mine. We have a low-grade nickel mine. We blow stuff up through the mining cycle. We sell the raw ore. We have an offtake agreement with Glencore, which many of you would be familiar with, for low-grade nickel. But what's interesting is that low-grade nickel is very limited value. Very limited value. Our revenue that we receive from blowing up the mine and selling the ore, blowing up the ore and selling it, is rather negligible. So a seasoned mining executive will look at our mine and say, why are you even keeping it open? Our operating costs for ventilation and labor and heat and electricity is unbelievable. So we strategically made a pivot to say, well, we're not going to make money on the ore. What is something we can do to enhance the competitiveness and productivity of the mining industry in our region? So we have converted that mine to do two things. It looks like any other operating mine, but it is a center of training and development for those interested in getting a job in the mining industry. And I'll be honest, that's where we make most of our money. That's a competitive private business that falls under the conglomerate of Norcat. But the other thing that we discovered is critically important. Many of these small technology companies, and if you think back, why do we care about them? Because that's the driver of job creation. That creates a sustainable innovation cluster. But one of the biggest challenges that they have beyond access to mentorship and access to capital is they need to have their first reference customer. And for existing companies, they need a place to test, prototype, develop new technologies that they want to sell into the broader mining market. So our asset, the operating mine, has been repurposed to serve as an underground technology testing center. And what's really interesting is that work can be done in an array of tunnels in the community of Sudbury where we are. There are holes in mountains, underground tunnels, everywhere in that community because it has a 100-year history of mining. But what the differentiator is and what helps our cluster be sustainable is that we have repurposed an operating mine to be a technology testing center for both startup, small, medium, even large companies like Cisco, put in products that are pre-commercialized to test them in an operating a mine environment. So when the test is done, if the results are favorable, they don't say they've done a test. They say Norcat was their first customer, and that really helps in getting the second sale. So that's part of the role that we're playing in our community, in addition to the other services that we offer. I won't spend time on this because I've highlighted, but just to give you an example, this is our operating mine site. This is one of our clients. testing a large industrial piece of equipment. This company has pretty sizable market cap in what it builds, but this is a product that had yet to go to market. They spent 6 weeks underground with a team of engineers, salespeople, technologists, and then they would bring customers in, prospective new buyers, to say, come see our technology in the operating mine environment. The other thing I want to conclude with is there's a strong recognition, as I mentioned at the onset, because we are in such a low density area. You know, Canada has a systemic problem, you know, massive country, small population, therefore, you know, you can walk 10 miles and not see your neighbor. It's very sparse density. So even with the community of Sudbury and Timmins, where the epicenter of mining technology and innovation is in Canada, very often some of these small startup companies come to us at the NORCAT Innovation Mill with challenges. And we look internally and realize we're a small community. We only have so many smart people that we can try to get to mentor these companies and answer questions. So the one thing from a national level that Canada has done, and more specifically the province of Ontario, to ensure ongoing competitiveness and productivity of a variety of industries, is created a network of innovation centers that are almost forced to work together because we get funding from the government, so forced collaboration. And why that's important, when companies come into us asking questions, if we can't answer it, I can pick up the phone and connect these companies with resources in other jurisdictions around the country. So you have a regional challenge, but you have a recognition that to be competitive on the global stage, the country must work together. We're 35 million people. Like we struggle competing on the global stage, but we recognize if we bring everyone together and create virtual density, we actually have a shot. So as I mentioned at the onset, I just wanted to share some experiences of what we believe is driving a productive and innovative mining cluster. I shared with you kind of the recipe book, and I've worked in multiple countries around the world validating that, and recognize that every country has a slight nuance on those. But again, the startup and small enterprises drive the job creation, and working together, we're seemingly starting to see very strong results. So I'll leave it at that, and if anyone had any questions, by all means, I'm happy to answer, and I'll be here for the afternoon. Thank you again for the opportunity.